and welcome to our instructional series of videos. In this installment, we're going to show you how to upgrade or replace the stock PCIe SSD in the late 2013 21.5-inch iMac. Replacing the PCIe SSD in these iMacs is an advanced installation with a risk of damage to your screen. It's highly recommended that you watch this video in its entirety before proceeding. If you're unsure about completing this installation yourself, professional installation is available. We've already backed up our data, gathered our materials, shut down and unplugged the iMac, and are working on a soft static-free work surface. We're now ready to begin. The first thing we need to do is remove the display of the iMac. It's held in place with an adhesive around the edges, which you'll have to cut apart. This can be a tricky process and runs a risk of cracking the display, so you'll need to be very careful. Starting on one of the lower corners, insert the screen removal tool between the glass and the chassis. Take care not to put too much stress on the glass itself, or it may crack. Work along all the edges of the iMac. All we're doing is cutting the tape holding the display on, not prying the glass away. The process can take a little time, so be patient. The corners may be a little tricky, so you may need to go over them a couple of times. Once you've worked your way all the way around, you can lay the computer face up on your work surface and attach the suction cups to the upper corners. Do one last check to make sure you've loosened all the adhesive around the edges of the iMac. Then lift the glass partway up using the suction cups. Inside, towards the top center, you'll need to detach two cables. For the first, simply slide it out of its socket. For the second cable, first lift up on the metal handle to unlock the connector, then slide the connector out. You can then angle the display the rest of the way up and remove the adhesive holding the bottom of the display. Simply grab the tab on each side of the adhesive strip and slowly pull it towards the center until it comes free. Finally, use your opening tool to slit the last little bit of adhesive along the center, and you should be able to lift the display free and set it aside. Now's a good time to peel up any residual adhesive that remains on the display so we can replace it with new adhesive later. Then, do the same for any adhesive on the iMac chassis itself. The PCIe SSD is located on the back of the main logic board. In order to reach it, we'll need to remove much of the iMac's internals. First, we'll start with the strip along the lip of the iMac, which is held in place by 5 small Phillips screws, which we'll need to remove. You should then be able to slide the piece out of the iMac. We can now remove the fan, which is held in by these 3 Torx T10 screws. Loosen these screws, then disconnect the fan cable by sliding its connector from its socket. You can now lift the fan up and out of the iMac and set it aside. Next, we'll move on to the left speaker. Start by loosening the 2 Torx T10 screws holding it in place. You can now slide the speaker cable from its socket and out from under the metal clip and the hard drive bay. Pull the speaker assembly slightly out of the iMac, which will allow you to unplug the power button cable from the power supply and remove it from the channel along the speaker unit. You can then remove the speaker assembly entirely. Next, we need to remove the hard drive. Remove the two Torx T10 screws from the retainer holding in the outer edge of the hard drive. These screws are the same size and should be kept with this retainer. Then, do the same with the other side. Note that these screws are of different lengths. Once you've done that, you can lift the drive up slightly and detach it from the SATA cable, allowing you to remove the drive from the iMac completely. For the power board, first remove these two Torx T10 screws. Next, detach the power supply signal cable by sliding its connector from its slot. You should now be able to pull the power board forward and up so you can disconnect this larger power connector. There's a small latch on the underside which you'll need to push down on in order to release it. It'll likely be a tight fit, so you may need to wiggle it a bit in order to get it to come free. There's one last cable to disconnect, which is attached underneath the lip of the iMac, just behind the Apple logo. Press down on the latch of its connector and slide it out too. You can now set the power board aside. Remove the single Torx T10 screw holding in the hard drive bay, then lift it up and remove the SATA cable from the channels underneath. You can then remove the cables from underneath the clip on the chassis. Moving on to the right speaker, loosen the two Torx T10 screws holding it in place. Then, slide the antenna cable out of the groove along the outer edge of the speaker. You should now be able to slide the speaker connector from its socket, allowing you to remove the speaker entirely. Now it's time to disconnect the AirPort and Bluetooth cables from the board. To help keep them in the right order, you may want to place a piece of tape over the cables. You can then disconnect the cables by carefully lifting up on the snap connectors. Disconnect the camera cable by lifting up on the metal latch, then sliding the connector out of its socket. The headphone connector simply lifts up and off of its socket. Now we can remove the four Torx T10 screws holding the board in place. Finally, remove the 4 Torx T8 screws holding the heatsink to the chassis. We should now be able to remove the main logic board from the iMac. The SSD module is located here near the I/O ports. To remove the original drive, first remove its Torx T8 retaining screw. Then, slide the drive out of its socket. The new drive will have a notch in its connector, which will line up with a pin in the PCIe SSD slot. Slide the drive into its slot until it's fully seated. Then, secure it with its Torx T8 screw. Now we're ready to replace the logic board back into the iMac. Located near the I/O ports are 2 pins. These 2 pins line up with these 2 slots in the iMac's chassis to help align the board when replacing it. Set the logic board back into the iMac, taking care not to trap any cables underneath. The pins and slots shown earlier will help indicate when the board is properly positioned. We can now reattach the board to the iMac with the 4 Torx T10 screws. Then, attach the heatsink. The longer T8 screws go on the side towards the top of the iMac, and the smaller ones go towards the bottom. Now we can reconnect all the cables to the logic board. Arrange the Bluetooth and airport antenna cables over their connectors. The tape should have kept them in the right order. Then, snap the connectors together by pushing them straight down. You can then remove the piece of tape. For the headphone cable, simply align the 2 connectors and snap them together. Slide the camera cable into its socket, then use the metal bar to latch it into place. Next, put the right speaker back into place. Then, slide the speaker connector into its socket. Once you've done that, push the antenna cable into its slot along the edge of the speaker. Finally, secure the speaker by tightening its 2 Torx T10 screws. Route the SATA cable through the tabs on the bottom of the drive bay. Then slide the cable underneath the clip next to the heatsink. Finally, set the bay into place and secure it with its Torx T10 screw. Attach the SATA connection on your drive to the one on the iMac SATA cable, then lay the drive flat in the bay. Take the power supply board and plug the smaller cable into its socket near the Apple logo. Next, attach the larger power cable to the socket that's on the underside of the logic board. You can now set the power supply board back into the iMac so that it lays flat and secure it with its 2 Torx T10 screws. We can now replace the hard drive retaining pieces. The one near the SATA connection uses the 2 medium-length Torx T10 screws. For the other side, the short screw goes through the topmost hole, while the longer one goes through the power supply board. Set the left speaker partially into place so that just the narrow end is under the lip of the iMac. Slide the power supply signal cable into its socket. Then run the speaker cable under the hard drive bay and the clip by the heatsink. Then slide the connector into its socket. The solid wrapped portion of the power button cable goes in the groove that runs across the face of the speaker assembly. Then, the twisted wire goes in the groove along the side of the speaker. You can now move the speaker into place and tighten its 2 Torx T10 screws. Finally, slide the power button cable's connector into its socket. Set the fan into place so that it sits flush against the heatsink. Then, secure it with its 3 Torx T10 screws. Finally, slide the fan connector into its socket. The last thing to replace is the strip along the bottom lip of the iMac. Take one of the longer Phillips screws and attach one of the corners, rotating the strip into place as you tighten the screw. Then, replace the remaining longer screws in the outer positions. The smaller Phillips screw goes in the centermost position. We're now ready to close up. Set the display tape pieces in place according to the diagram that comes with the kit. You'll know they're positioned correctly if all the holes and cutouts line up correctly with the shape of the iMac chassis. Once you've determined all the pieces of tape have been placed correctly, peel off the backing and adhere them to their places on the iMac. You can help line it up easier by inserting a pointed object through the hole in the tape and using it to line the tape up with the corresponding hole in the iMac's chassis. You can then peel off the backing on the other side to expose the adhesive that will attach the display. Set the display along the bottom edge as flush with the lip and as centered as possible, but don't let it close yet as we need to reconnect the last two cables. Reattach the video cable by sliding the connector into its socket and locking it into place with the handle. Then, simply slide the last connector into its socket. You can now carefully lower the display into place, making sure you have the edges lined up correctly. Gently squeeze along the edges to make sure the adhesive sticks. Use the microfiber cloth to avoid any extra fingerprints. You can now remove the suction cups and clean any remaining marks off your iMac. You can now plug your iMac back in, hook it up, and turn it on.